The smell of aviation aluminum mixes with fresh paint in the Toulouse assembly halls in the spring of 1978. French and German engineers debate in 3 languages over blueprint tables while champagne glasses clink in the executive boardroom above. Yet the celebration feels forced. Everyone knows the numbers on the wall chart. Boeing owns 60% of the global airliner market. Airbus has exactly 1 aircraft in production, the A300, and after 6 years of trying, they have sold just 250 of them. The consortium needs a second act, and they need it fast. The path they chose will teach them one of aviation's most expensive lessons. Sometimes being technically right means being strategically wrong. The late 70s present Airbus with a puzzle wrapped in a paradox. Airlines keep asking for something that sounds simple. They want a smaller A300 that can fly longer routes with around 200 passengers. Swiss Air and Lufthansa are especially insistent. They have routes across Europe and thin transatlantic city pairs that do not need the A300's full 270 seats. They still want the comfort of a twin-aisle cabin and the efficiency of 2 engines. Think about it this way. You run a restaurant. Your 12-table dining room works great on weekends, but Monday through Thursday you only fill 6 tables. Do you build a smaller room, or do you absorb the cost of heating and lighting empty space? Airlines face this exact dilemma every day, except their empty rooms fly at 30,000 feet while burning thousands of dollars of fuel every hour. The math looks compelling on paper. Take the proven A300 fuselage, remove 13 frames to shorten it, design a smaller wing optimized for the lighter weight, keep the same comfortable A-to-breast seating that passengers like, and create instant commonality with the A300 for airlines that operate both. Development will cost $450 million instead of the billions needed for a clean sheet design. The whole program can be done in 4 years instead of 7. Bernard Latieri, the Airbus president, tells reporters that the A310 will be flying by 1982. He just forgets to mention how many Boeing 767s will be flying then too. On July 7, 1978, Swiss Air and Lufthansa signed launch orders for what Airbus calls the A310. The champagne flows more freely that night. Europe finally has an answer to Boeing's growing family of jets. At least that is what everyone in Toulouse believes. What Airbus does not fully grasp is that Boeing has been working on the exact same problem. While Airbus engineers are shrinking the A300, Boeing is creating not 1 aircraft but 2, the narrow-body 757 and the wide-body 767. Both will share the same modern 2-crew cockpit and remove the need for a flight engineer. Pilots will gain a common type rating to fly both. Airlines will get a flexibility in fleet planning that they never had before. The 767 aims directly at the same market segment as the A310, those 200 to 250 seat routes that are too long for narrow bodies yet too thin for jumbos. Here's the kicker. Boeing's 767 program manager, Jack Steiner, visits Toulouse in 1977. He sits through an A300 presentation, takes notes, smiles politely, flies home to Seattle, and tells his team to work faster. The 767 will fly just 66 days after the A310. The race is on, though neither company fully understands what they are racing towards. Commercial aviation stands at the edge of a revolution that will make a decade of assumptions obsolete. British Airspace sees opportunity in the A310 program. The United Kingdom withdrew from the Airbus consortium in 1969 and watched from the sidelines as France and Germany built the A300. Now a new aircraft needs a new wing. Britain has leverage to rejoin. The deal is elegant. British Aerospace will design and build the A310 wing and establish the UK as Airbus's centre of excellence for wing technology. Work will start in Hatfield, move to Filton for design, and see production at Broughton in Wales. This was not just any wing. British engineers create a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency, smaller and more advanced than the A300 wing. Every curve and angle is optimized for the A310 mission profile. They incorporate supercritical airfoils to reduce drag at cruise. The wing is so specialized and so perfectly tailored to this one aircraft that it cannot be adapted to any other Airbus plane. That single choice will matter more than anyone realizes at the time. The A310 brings another revolution to Airbus. It introduces the first 2-crew glass cockpit in the Airbus fleet. 6 television-style screens replace hundreds of dials and gauges. Computers monitor systems that once demanded a flight engineer's constant attention. Within 10 years, the flight engineer position vanishes from commercial aviation, and tens of thousands of jobs go with it. Airbus then does something clever. They give the same cockpit to the improved A300-600 and create the first true wide-body family with common type rating. A pilot qualified on the A310 can walk across the ramp and fly an A300-600 with minimal transition. For airliners, this means real savings in training and scheduling and a new flexibility that shows up on balance sheets. Singapore Airlines jumps on this advantage. They calculate that common type rating will save millions per year in training costs alone. They order 23 A310s. They also retire every single one by the mid-2000s. Yet that part of the story comes later. 2 versions emerge from the production line. The A310-200 serves as the baseline. The A310-300 pushes the range envelope further. The 300 variant includes something ingenious, a fuel tank in the horizontal stabilizer that can automatically transfer fuel during flight to keep the aircraft's center of gravity at the optimal point for efficiency. As fuel burns off from the main tanks, computers pump fuel forward or aft in the tail tank to maintain perfect trim. This saves thousands of pounds of fuel on long flights, and the idea later appears in advanced forms on the A300 and A340. The system is so complex that Airbus publishes a long manual just to explain it. Many pilots never read the first few pages. As the A310 enters service in 1983 with Swiss Air, another revolution is brewing that will change twin-engine economics. For decades, twins have been confined by a 60-minute rule. They must stay within an hour of a suitable airport in case one engine fails. That rule, born in the days of pistons, keeps twins off oceanic and polar routes. Engine reliability keeps improving year after year. By the early 1980s, high bypass turbofans are shutting down so rarely that statisticians use scientific notation to express the probability. Think 1 failure per 100,000 flight hours. That's like driving your car to the moon and back without the engine quitting once. Regulators take notice. In 1985, they introduce a framework for extended range operations. If an airline meets strict maintenance and training standards, its twin-engine jets can venture 120 minutes from the nearest suitable airport. By 1988, this stretches to 180 minutes. The A310 and Boeing 767 become pioneers of this new world. In June 1989, Lufthansa flies an A310-300 on scheduled service across the North Atlantic. 4 years earlier, that would have been illegal. The age of the twin-engine widebody has truly arrived. By 1990, 7 years after entry into service, Airbus has delivered fewer than 150 A310s. Boeing is producing 767s at a far faster rate. The American manufacturer will eventually build over 1,300, and production continues in freighter and tank variants. The A310 line limps along, rarely exceeding 3 aircraft per month, and finally delivers its last aircraft to Uzbekistan Airways in June 1998. What went wrong? The answer is not one catastrophic failure, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Each one teaches Airbus a painful lesson about market timing and product positioning. First comes the Boeing combination attack. The 757 and 767 arrive together with identical cockpits. When airlines compare fleets, they see 2 Boeing aircraft covering everything from short-haul to transcontinental routes with shared crews. The 767-300ER proves devastating to A310 sales. It can fly slightly farther with more passengers. More important, it comes from Boeing's large global support network. American carriers that dominate international travel naturally gravitate towards the American manufacturer. United, American, and Delta choose 767s over A310s. Without the huge United States market, the A310 is fighting for scraps. Next, Airbus accidentally competes with itself. The A300-600, which shares the A310 cockpit, offers more seats for similar operating costs. On many routes, these extra seats mean better revenue potential. Why buy the smaller A310 when the A300 uses the same pilots, the same spare parts, and the same maintenance procedures, yet carries 50 more paying passengers? Airbus creates 2 aircraft that overlap awkwardly. Customers are confused. Sales are cannibalized. The military market offers false hope. Airbus pitches the A310 as a multi-role tanker transport. Germany and Canada buy small numbers and convert them for aerial refueling and medical evacuation. The big prize, the United States Air Force tanker contract, goes to Boeing again and again. The market that Airbus hopes will absorb dozens of A310s instead takes only a handful. By the mid-1990s, Airbus execs face reality. The A310 will never be a profit engine. The specialized wing designed specifically for it cannot be adapted to other aircraft. The production line, tooled for a small run, becomes a financial milestone. Each A310 that rolls out of Toulouse is essentially hand-built and lacks the scale that makes the 737 and 767 cash cows for Boeing. The final insult comes from within Airbus itself. As the company develops the A330 and A340 family during the early 1990s, the smaller A330-200 ends up replacing everything the A310 was supposed to do and does it better. The A330-200 can fly farther with more passengers and more cargo, while offering better fuel economy per seat. It shares commonality with the larger A330-300 and the 4-engine A340. Airlines get a true family of aircraft from about 250 to well over 370 seats, all flown by the same pilots. The A330 family goes on to receive well over 1,800 orders. The A310 total of 255 deliveries looks like a rounding error by comparison. When Airbus quietly closes the A300 and A310 production line in 2007, there are no commemorative ceremonies and no misty speeches. The market has already moved on. Here is the deeper irony that becomes clear only in hindsight. Every mistake Airbus makes with the A310 teaches a lesson that fuels later dominance. The pain of watching Boeing win with cockpit commonality in the 757 and 767 drives Airbus to make the A318, A319, A320, and A321 a coherent family. All four variants, from about 100 to roughly 240 seats, share the same type rating. That family becomes one of the most successful product lines in aviation history. The frustration of creating an orphan wing for the A310 pushes Airbus to think in terms of scalable platforms. When engineers design the A330 and A340, they create wings that can be adapted and improved across variants. The composite materials and manufacturing techniques developed later for the A350 wing trace their heritage to lessons learned from the A310 dead end. The bitter experience of having two overlapping aircraft in the A300-600 and the A310 teaches Airbus to separate products clearly. The modern lineup reflects that discipline. The A220 handles the 100 to 150 seat space. The A320 family covers roughly 150 to 240. The A330neo serves the 260 to 300 seat market. The A350 steps into the 300 to 410 seat range. Each aircraft has its mission with minimal overlap. More importantly, the A310 teaches patience. Being first to market means little if you're selling the wrong product. Boeing may have won the 1980s battle of the twin-aisle twins. Airbus learns enough from that defeat to fight Boeing to a draw in the narrow-body market and eventually surpass them in important wide-body campaigns. The United Kingdom's work on the A310 wing establishes Britain as Airbus's centre of wing excellence. That position remains today. Every Airbus wing, from the smallest to the largest, carries British DNA. The facilities at Broughton that tool up for the A310 wing production later produced more than 100 wing sets per month for the A320 family. What begins as a ticket back into the consortium becomes one of its core advantages. The two-crew cockpit pioneered on the A310 becomes a foundation for the Airbus approach that blends glass displays with smart automation. Those early CRTs give way to modern displays. The idea that computers can monitor systems better than humans is controversial in 1982. Now it's routine. Modern pilots train on aircraft where the computer acts like a quiet partner that handles thousands of checks before takeoff and after landing. Even the clever tail fuel tank lives on. The concept evolves into sophisticated fuel management on modern Airbus aircraft. Computers constantly optimize distribution for efficiency and stability. What seems like over-engineering on the A310 becomes standard practice across the industry. Small incremental gains, managed relentlessly by software, adds up to real money across fleets. Walk through an aviation museum and you might spot an A310 parked between giants. Its white fuselage slowly chalks in the sun. Tour guides rarely linger. There are no dramatic stories of records broken. No movies that were made about the A310. Few pilots write memoirs about their affection for this quiet twin. Yet that aircraft represents something important in aviation history. It is the costly education that built an empire. Every rivet in that fuselage, every curve of that wing, and every line of code in that pioneering cockpit teaches Airbus something about what the market wants versus what the engineers imagine. The consortium that enters the 1980s with one struggling aircraft and a dream of challenging Boeing emerges from the A310 experience bruised yet wiser. They learn that commonality sells only if you have a complete family. They learn that technical superiority means nothing if your competitor has better timing and better distribution. They learn that the smartest engineers can design the wrong product when the customer problem is framed by habit rather than by need. Today, Airbus commands roughly half of the global market. The order book stretches far into the future. Airlines configure entire fleets around Airbus commonality, exactly as the A310 concept promised but failed to deliver at scale. The company that once celebrated 58 launch orders as a triumph now announces deals for hundreds of aircraft during a single air show. The A310 is not a mistake. It is tuition. Expensive tuition for an education in market reality, customer psychology, and strategic patience. Every Airbus success since then, from the A320 family to the composite revolution of the A350, carries DNA from the lessons learned in Toulouse between 1978 and 1998. So when aviation enthusiasts gather to debate commercial disappointments, when they list glamorous misfits and heroic dead ends, remember the A310 differently. It is not a glorious failure that pushed too hard against the boundaries of the possible. It is the quiet teacher that shows Airbus how far the gap can be between good engineering and good strategy. If stories of ambition, miscalculation, and redemption in aviation capture your imagination, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment about which aircraft you think taught the industry the most expensive lesson. Next time, we'll explore how Boeing's own attempt to revolutionize short-haul flying became a cautionary tale written in aluminum and ambition.